This is Jill Janes with my in-depth review of a dissertation for 792. The dissertation that I selected was written by Tate and completed in 2002. It focused on the relationship between states' interpretation of the IDEA and rates of identification for children with emotional disturbance, a grounded theory comparative analysis. Tate completed her dissertation at George Washington, a university which has several graduate programs in education, including a PhD in educational leadership and some certificates and specializations in special education. And her committee seemed highly qualified to advise her in this process. She included two researchers, her committee chair, and another committee member with a background in special ed who have continued to publish and serve in roles highly regarded as experts in special ed, and then two additional committee members that she acknowledges for their support and methodology. And a little research on those committee members found they have worked for research foundations and clearly have the credentials to advise her in that way. A review of Tate's dissertation began with the significance and conceptual framework. Tate clearly states that the significance lies in her intention, which is a theoretical model for the relationship between interpretation of IDEA for children with ED and the identification rates of children for the special ed services within those states. And in Chapter 2, as well as in a little bit of the introduction in Chapter 1, the author does a really nice job of using literature to substantiate the debates around interpretation and identification that currently exist for children with ED, and the significance of this particular study to perhaps lead future work and a more equitable use of IDEA to serve those children. Tate uses a conceptual framework that employs ecology of ED, thinking about how those children interact with their environment as well as the environment interacting with them, and considering how those environmental factors play a role in the identification and definition of ED in different contexts and states. And then she also includes aspects of public policy and legislative influence, particularly thinking about federalism with a federal policy like IDEA, and then states' roles in interpreting and playing out that policy. Methods, design, and data analysis were reviewed next, as they were presented in Chapter 3. Tate lays out that her study was clearly guided by 4 research questions. The 4th question being, is it possible to devise a theoretical model for her study, with the first 3 looking at similarities and differences in definitions of ED within IDEA and in assessment procedures for determining if students are eligible or not for those services. Tate uses a grounded theory methodology and does a really nice job of explaining the rationale, explaining that grounded theory can be used when there is interpretation involved and subjectivity, and in thinking about its particular use with documents and analyzing documents as, in particular language within them as hermeneutic units that can be studied for their interpretation and overall meaning within that document. So with that in mind, she analyzed states' IDEA regulatory documents, looking particularly for the definition and assessment procedures for identifying children with ED. And then she also used data that she had access to from an internship that had the rate of children served in each particular state with who were children identified as having ED and served with IDEA. Before doing any analysis, the states were grouped by identification rate, with a high ID rate, medium, and low. And then as the analysis was completed, Tate states that she rotated through those categories so that not all of the high identification rates were looked at first, but high, medium, low to make sure that she had a clear head as she did the analysis. And then the analysis is described as 2 phases. One phase selecting the grounded theory methodology and setting up the categories that would be used with support from the literature to begin the analysis, and then using open, axial, and selective coding and following grounded theory methodology to do that and find the themes. And then Tate also describes using Atlas software to help and assist in that process. And finally, my review looked at the results and the implications of the dissertation presented in Chapter 4 and in Chapter 5 with discussion related to the literature. Findings were always presented by the research question, and Tate utilized flowcharts to highlight the essential elements and categories that were found in her analysis that fit the similarities and differences for definitions and assessment procedures. And then a potential model is presented, though Tate clearly states that her findings don't support a clear theoretical model for overall identification, but when she grouped the states by definition of ED within their IDEA policies, she did find that one category of states, she called her alternative category, may potentially support a theoretical model, and she proposes that as well. Literature is employed to discuss the implications, and she clearly states that the variance in the findings that she has, as well as what the literature supports, shows that additional work may need to be done surrounding IDEA and in policy and how it is implemented and its overall purpose, as it seems to vary by state. My critique and takeaways were that this was an excellent dissertation overall. I rated everything excellent in quality of writing and quality of content, with the exception of the conceptual framework that seemed to be lacking slightly with its use of public policy to support the overall framework. But aside from that, excellent quality. Tate is very clear and concise in her organization, seems to lead the reader through the dissertation. I particularly liked the way the author laid out exactly what would be talked about in each section or each chapter, talked about it, and then did a nice summary always within, whether it was within the section or within the chapter. For instance, in the literature review, Tate clearly spelled out exactly what 4 things were going to be reviewed in the introduction, and then within each section, each one of those 4 sections, the literature was kind of funneled from a broad base down to specifics, and then at the end of each section was a small summary of what had been reviewed, as well as at the end of the chapter an overall summary. I found that to be a really high quality and helped to lead the reader through, particularly a reader like me who doesn't have a background in special ed or the policy that was being studied. I also felt that the use of the grounded theory was very strong, with strong implementation, and very clear, again, clearly written too, but it was clear that the author wasn't just saying that grounded theory was employed. There had been a lot of steps taken to ensure that that was implemented soundly. My personal process and takeaway from the review process was this process of refining and thinking initially when I did my initial review that I needed to look into my topic of teacher leadership. And then as I moved along, the process became more oriented towards methodology and what I wanted to do with my topic, and hence I settled on this particular dissertation. My big takeaway from that is that I now have some really good examples of explaining how grounded theory could be employed and what I might do, as well as the use of visuals and charts. I felt that was a strong thing in this dissertation that would help me as I'm putting my own together to think through how I can use narrative as well as visuals to support my findings. Overall, it was a process that I found very helpful as I move forward.